The South Atlantic looked peaceful that morning, maybe too peaceful. The water was smooth like glass, with only tiny waves breaking here and there. A thin mist floated just above the surface, and far away, the sea seemed to melt into the gray sky. Nothing looked dangerous. Nothing gave away what was about to happen. The German supply ship Python moved slowly through the calm water. Her engines made a low, steady sound deep inside the ship, a quiet thud that echoed through the metal hull. To anyone looking at her from afar, she looked harmless, like an ordinary cargo ship carrying goods from one port to another. But that was a lie. The Python wasn't a normal merchant ship. She didn't belong to any company. She didn't appear on any official list or map. She was one of Germany's secret ships, part of a hidden system used during World War II to keep the German submarine fleet alive far out at sea. Inside her storage rooms were barrels of fuel, boxes of food, spare torpedoes, and mechanical parts for repairs. Her real job was to sneak across the ocean and refuel German U-boats, the deadly submarines that hunted Allied ships in the Atlantic Ocean. These submarines depended on supply ships like Python to survive. Without them, they would run out of food and fuel long before they could return to Germany. By late 1941, the war at sea, known as the Battle of the Atlantic, had become a brutal struggle. The German U-boats had one mission: to sink every ship carrying supplies to Britain. Britain needed those ships to survive. They brought food, fuel, and weapons from America and its colonies. If the U-boats could cut off those supply lines, Britain would starve, and Germany might win the war. But there was a problem for the Germans. The Atlantic Ocean was massive, thousands of miles wide, and U-boats could not travel forever without refueling. They needed diesel, oil, and food after every few weeks of patrol. So the German Navy, known as the Kriegsmarine, came up with a clever plan. They sent out large ships that pretended to be merchants, but secretly carried everything the U-boats needed. These were called supply ships, or milch cows. The Python was one of the last of these secret supply ships still operating in the South Atlantic, a quiet, lonely region far from Europe. Earlier in the war, the Germans had lost several of their supply ships to the British. British aircraft and naval cruisers had started to track them down. The Allies were getting smarter. They had even started breaking some of Germany's secret radio codes, which told them where these ships might be hiding. Because of that, the German Navy was now desperate to protect the few supply ships they had left. And the Python was one of the most important. In late November 1941, the Python anchored in the open South Atlantic, roughly halfway between Africa and South America. There were no islands nearby, no land in sight, just endless ocean. That day, she was meeting two German submarines, U-68 and UA. Both had been on long missions and were running dangerously low on fuel, food, and torpedoes. The Python's job was simple: refuel them, give them supplies, and then send them back to war. It was supposed to be an easy, quick job. A few days at most. The crew worked day and night, pumping oil through thick hoses and hauling heavy boxes across the deck. The sea was calm, and the weather was clear. Everything looked safe. But they never relaxed. Every man on the Python and the U-boats knew how risky this operation was. The British were constantly patrolling the Atlantic, hunting for German ships. Even a single mistake, a radio signal too strong, smoke too thick, or a message sent at the wrong time, could reveal their location. So while they worked, the German sailors kept glancing toward the horizon, scanning for any shape that looked out of place. A dark speck in the distance. A faint glimmer of metal. Anything that could mean trouble. The U-boat commanders came up on deck to talk with the Python's officers. They discussed how long the resupply would take and how much fuel each submarine needed. They also talked about the war, about how the U-boats had been doing well, sinking British ships near Africa and the Caribbean. Their morale was high. They believed they were still safe in this part of the ocean. The South Atlantic, they thought, was too far away for the British Navy to reach. The nearest Allied bases were thousands of miles away. No one expected to run into trouble there. But that confidence would soon cost them everything. Because far away, just over the horizon, a British cruiser was already on its way. And the Germans didn't know it yet, but this calm morning would soon turn into chaos. Here's what happened next. At around midday, a lookout on the Python saw something faint and dark in the distance. At first, he thought it was a shadow or maybe a cloud near the water. But as minutes passed, the shape grew larger. He raised his binoculars, and froze. It was a warship. The shape of the bow, the size, the guns on deck, everything about it was wrong. It wasn't a merchant ship. It wasn't another U-boat. It was British. He shouted down to the bridge. Officers rushed to the binoculars. Then came the chilling words that no German sailor wanted to hear. Enemy warship approaching. The calm of the ocean vanished instantly. Sirens sounded across the ship. Men dropped what they were doing. The U-boats disconnected their fuel lines and began diving, fast. They couldn't fight a cruiser. Their only chance was to disappear below the waves. But the Python couldn't dive. She was stuck on the surface, a slow, heavy ship. And she was now completely exposed. The approaching vessel was the British heavy cruiser HMS Dorsetshire. Armed with powerful 8-inch guns, she could destroy the Python in a matter of minutes. The British had somehow found them, maybe by decoding radio messages, maybe by pure luck. But it didn't matter. The Dorsetshire was already closing in, fast. The German captain of the Python, Captain Lieutenant Ernst Ludwig Hausmann, knew there was no escape. His ship was too slow to outrun a cruiser, and she wasn't built for battle. The only thing he could do now was prevent the British from capturing her, and her secrets. So he gave one final order. Abandon ship. Scuttle her. That meant, leave the ship and sink it yourself. The crew scrambled to lower lifeboats while the engineers rushed below deck to plant explosive charges. The goal was to destroy everything before the British could board. Within minutes, explosions shook the Python. Black smoke billowed out. Her hull cracked, and the deck began to tilt. The ocean started swallowing her. From the British cruiser, the sailors watched through binoculars. They didn't fire a single shot. The Dorsetshire's captain understood what was happening. The Germans were destroying their own ship. And then, slowly, the Python slipped beneath the waves, disappearing into the deep with a hiss of steam and oil. The ocean fell quiet again. The British ship turned away, leaving behind a floating mess of lifeboats, debris, and survivors. That was the moment the German submariners realized they had made a fatal mistake. They had believed the South Atlantic was safe, too far for Allied ships to reach. But now, one of their last supply ships was gone. More than 300 men from the Python were now stranded on the open sea, surrounded by nothing but water. Some were rescued by nearby U-boats, but the submarines quickly became dangerously crowded. They were built for around 50 men, not 100 or more. The rescued sailors had to ride on the decks, exposed to wind, rain, and waves. Every time the submarines dove underwater to avoid detection, the men clinging outside were forced to hold tight, or die. It was a nightmare journey. They traveled for days, weak and sunburned, trying to reach safer waters. When they finally made it back to friendly bases, the damage was done. The loss of the Python was a serious blow to Germany's war effort at sea. From that point on, the U-boats couldn't operate freely in the far corners of the Atlantic anymore. They were forced to stay closer to Europe, where they could refuel and resupply more easily. The German Navy tried to replace ships like Python with special long-range submarines, milch cow U-boats, that carried extra fuel and supplies. But soon, the Allies learned to hunt those down too. The loss of Python marked the beginning of the end for Germany's secret supply network in the Atlantic. It was one mistake, one small moment of overconfidence, that changed the entire course of their naval war. Sometime during the morning of November 1, 1941, the lookout on the Python's bridge noticed a faint silhouette far off to the north. At first, it looked like another cargo ship. Then, through the binoculars, came the unmistakable lines of a heavy cruiser, big, dark, and fast. The ship's captain, Captain Lieutenant Ernst Ludwig Hausmann, felt his stomach drop. The enemy had found them. Word spread like lightning across the deck. Engines were ordered to full power. The U-boats dove as fast as they could, disappearing beneath the waves. But the Python had no such option. She was slow, heavily loaded, and couldn't outrun a warship. Within minutes, the British cruiser HMS Dorsetshire was bearing down, cutting through the waves like a blade. Hausmann knew he couldn't fight. The Python carried only light anti-aircraft guns, useless against a cruiser's heavy cannons. To resist would mean instant death. The British guns could shred her to pieces before she got a single shot off. The only question was what to do with the ship, and all the classified cargo aboard. The captain gathered his officers. There was no debate. They couldn't allow the British to capture the ship or its documents. The order was short and final. Abandon ship. Prepare to scuttle. As the British cruiser closed in, the Python's crew began lowering lifeboats into the sea. Below deck, engineers set explosive charges in the engine room and fuel compartments. The U-boats that had just refueled surfaced at a distance, unable to intervene but unwilling to leave their supply ship to die alone. The first shells from the Dorsetshire whistled through the air, warning shots. The British captain, wary of possible torpedoes, held his distance. Through binoculars, he could see the Germans scrambling. Then came a sudden boom. Python's self-destruction began. Explosions tore through her hull. Smoke and steam rose high as metal twisted and groaned. Within minutes, her bow dipped into the sea. The Python was going down. Crewmen leapt into lifeboats, paddling furiously away as the massive vessel tilted and slipped beneath the surface. Some men jumped directly into the oily water, clinging to debris. The U-boat commanders watched from a distance, helpless, as the last of Germany's vital supply ships vanished into the depths. The Dorsetshire held her fire. She didn't need to finish the job, the Germans had already done it for her. The British cruiser lingered briefly, circling the lifeboats, ensuring the ship was gone. Then, satisfied, she turned north and disappeared over the horizon. For the Germans, the nightmare was only beginning. More than 300 survivors, the entire crew of the Python and portions of the U-boat crews, were now adrift in the open Atlantic. They had no rescue ships nearby, no radio contact with home, and only a few lifeboats. Their supplies would last days at best. But the German Navy wasn't about to abandon its men. The submarines that had escaped began sending coded distress signals. One by one, other U-boats, U-124, U-129, and U-506, surfaced hundreds of miles away and set course for the area. It was a risky decision. Every transmission increased the chance the British could triangulate their location. But the call for help couldn't be ignored. Days passed before the first rescue submarines arrived. They found the lifeboats scattered across the ocean, the men burned by the sun, dehydrated, and exhausted. The U-boats began hauling them aboard, but there was a serious problem. A single submarine could barely hold 50 men. Now, each one had to take on dozens of extra survivors. Inside, there was no room to move. Men lay shoulder to shoulder on the floor, packed in like sardines. The air grew hot, stale, and almost unbreathable. Every dive meant shutting off the vents and sealing the hatches, trapping hundreds of bodies in a metal coffin surrounded by darkness and silence. The submarine commanders faced a terrible dilemma: they couldn't dive deep, or the men on the deck would drown. But staying on the surface risked being spotted by Allied planes. For days, they crept slowly northward, their decks lined with men hanging onto railings or sitting on the wet steel, exposed to wind and rain. It was one of the strangest sights of the entire Atlantic War, submarines crawling across the sea, so overloaded that men literally covered the hulls from bow to stern. At night, waves crashed over them. Some were washed away and never seen again. Others developed severe burns from the saltwater and sun exposure. Still, they pressed on. The U-boats formed a loose convoy, moving northward toward safer waters near the Canary Islands and then toward occupied France. Along the way, they were refueled by what few supply submarines, milch cows, were still operational. Every man aboard knew that if an aircraft spotted them, they'd have no chance to dive fast enough. Luck was on their side. No Allied patrols found them. After weeks of slow travel, the survivors finally reached the French port of Saint-Nazaire, exhausted but alive. They had made it back, but at a terrible cost. By mid-1942, the new milch cow submarines entered service, U-459, U-460, U-461, U-462, and several others. They met their smaller cousins in the mid-Atlantic, far from Allied aircraft range. For a short while, the system worked. Dozens of U-boats were able to double their patrol time, attacking convoys deep into the southern seas. German propaganda praised this invisible network of iron lifelines. But the Allies were learning fast. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had begun reading parts of the German naval Enigma traffic. Every time a milch cow sent its coordinates, Allied analysts took note. By the summer of 1943, these intercepts led Allied aircraft straight to the hidden refueling points. One after another, the supply submarines were ambushed. On July 30, 1943, U-461 was caught on the surface in the Bay of Biscay by Australian Sunderland bombers. Depth charges tore her apart, she exploded, scattering fuel across the sea. The same day, U-462 was attacked and sunk while leaving port. Within weeks, U-463, U-459, and U-460 all met similar fates. The entire milch cow fleet was wiped out. The destruction of these submarines traced back, in a way, to that single day in 1941 when the Python went down. Her loss had forced Germany to replace surface supply ships with underwater ones, a clever fix that only made them more predictable targets. For Donitz, the impact was devastating. Without refueling, his submarines could no longer stay out for long patrols. Many had to retreat to the North Atlantic, where Allied air patrols now roamed constantly. The hunter had become the hunted. Back in Berlin, the Naval High Command quietly reviewed the Python incident. They realized that the cruiser Dorsetshire had found her not by accident but through intelligence. Allied radio interception and direction finding had tracked several U-boat messages. Someone, somewhere, had sent one signal too many. That single mistake had exposed the meeting point, and cost Germany its last major supply ship. After that revelation, Donitz issued new orders forbidding any radio transmissions during refueling operations. But by then it was too late. The Allies had radar, long-range aircraft, and escort carriers sweeping the seas. Secrecy no longer guaranteed safety. Meanwhile, the men who had survived the Python were reassigned across the fleet. Some returned to sea, others trained new crews. They carried with them a grim lesson: in this new phase of the war, the ocean was shrinking. There were fewer places to hide, and every refueling, every repair, every message carried risk. In the ports of Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, U-boat crews still talked about the Python in hushed tones. They remembered the sight of the horizon suddenly darkening with the shape of the British cruiser, the smoke rising from their ship, the slow sinking. It became a cautionary legend among submariners, a reminder that even the smallest lapse could doom hundreds. By the end of 1943, the U-boat arm was collapsing. Losses were catastrophic. Convoy escorts, aircraft, and new Allied tactics destroyed them faster than Germany could build replacements. Supply failures made matters worse. U-boats often left port half-stocked, unable to venture far. Crews grew younger, less trained, more afraid. The once mighty wolf packs of 1940 had turned into scattered, starving predators by 1944. Many historians later said the decline began with logistics, not battles. A war machine runs on fuel and food, and the Python had been part of that bloodstream. When she sank, the lifeblood began to drain away. In occupied France, a few of the Python survivors worked on the docks as the tide of war turned. They watched Allied bombers roar overhead, bombing the very submarine pens they had once called home. Some helped repair damaged U-boats, others were captured when the Allies liberated France in 1944. A few survived the war entirely, returning to Germany in silence. None of them spoke much about the Python. There was pride, yes, but also guilt. They had done their duty, yet the mission they served had brought so much destruction. Many simply said, "We were sailors, and we followed orders." After the war, divers and historians tried to locate the wreck of the Python, but the South Atlantic is vast and unforgiving. No confirmed discovery has ever been made. Somewhere between Africa and South America, beneath thousands of meters of water, she still lies, a ghost of steel and rust, surrounded by silence. In naval museums, the name appears only briefly in records: Python, auxiliary tanker, sunk November 1941, South Atlantic. A footnote in a war filled with tragedies. But among naval historians, her story is seen as a turning point, the moment when Germany lost its ability to wage a truly global naval war. If she had survived, perhaps the U-boats could have operated longer in distant oceans. Perhaps the Battle of the Atlantic would have dragged on even deeper into 1944. But history doesn't bend to perhaps. One slip, one intercepted signal, and an entire strategy unraveled. For the Allied sailors who served aboard the Dorsetshire, the sinking of the Python was just another day's work. They didn't know they had crippled Germany's ocean network. In their logs, it was a short note: enemy supply ship scuttled by crew, survivors in lifeboats. They sailed away, unaware that this small action had changed the rhythm of a vast, hidden war. The ocean kept its secrets, as it always does. The waves rolled back over the wreckage, and within hours, the site looked untouched, only a thin sheen of oil marking the place where a nation's hopes had sunk. Years later, when historians pieced together the Battle of the Atlantic, they realized how fragile the U-boat campaign truly was. It wasn't defeated in one grand battle but in dozens of small losses, a ship here, a tanker there, each one cutting another artery. The Python's destruction was one of those quiet amputations that slowly bled the U-boat fleet dry. By May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, the oceans were filled with wrecks, hundreds of submarines lying broken on the seabed. Dönitz, who had once commanded them all, spent his last days as Führer of a dying Reich, surrounded by ruins. In Allied interrogation, when asked about the turning point of his naval campaign, he reportedly said, "When we lost the sea's freedom." Some people later said that when German sailors talked about that terrible year, they were really thinking of 1941, the year their secret supply ship, the Python, vanished under the waves. For the men who had served on her, that idea made perfect sense. They knew exactly what it felt like to lose everything in one moment. They had lived through the fear of watching their ship die, slowly tilting, sinking, and disappearing into the dark sea. They had spent days drifting helplessly in lifeboats, surrounded by nothing but endless water, waiting for rescue that might never come. They had felt the war change around them, right there in the middle of the ocean. It wasn't a story of heroism or victory. It wasn't about brave charges or famous battles. It was about what happens when a single mistake changes everything. The story of the Python is a reminder that war doesn't always turn on giant clashes or heroic deeds. Sometimes, it turns on small, quiet moments, a wrong assumption, a bit of bad luck, or a single misjudged signal. The Python was not a famous ship. She wasn't a battleship, and she wasn't built for fighting. She was just a supply vessel, meant to refuel submarines far from home. But when she was lost, it was like cutting a main artery. The U-boats that depended on her suddenly had nowhere to go. That's how wars really work, not just through the explosions and victories people remember, but through the unseen mistakes that change everything behind the scenes. For the Germans, the loss of the Python was more than just the sinking of a ship, it was the end of an illusion. Until that moment, many in the German Navy believed they ruled the open sea. They thought their submarines could appear and disappear like ghosts, striking anywhere and vanishing without a trace. They believed the South Atlantic, vast, empty, and far from Europe, was their safe zone. But when the Python went down, that illusion sank with her. They realized the ocean wasn't safe anymore. It wasn't silent. It wasn't theirs. Because that day, the sea itself seemed to betray them. The water that had once protected them now felt like a trap. The horizon that once looked empty was hiding enemies. The calm ocean that morning had fooled them, and that calm had cost them everything. After the Python was gone, many of her survivors spent the rest of the war remembering that silence, the moment after the explosion when the sea swallowed her. They said it was the strangest silence they ever heard. No shouting. No gunfire. Just the sound of water closing over twisted metal. They had seen a ship die. And in that moment, they understood how fragile their war effort really was. It was no longer a fight between two mighty fleets. It was a slow, creeping loss, of ships, of supplies, of hope. The story of the Python shows how one small part of a huge war can change everything. The ship wasn't famous, and her crew were ordinary sailors. But her loss weakened Germany's U-boat fleet, forcing them to fight without the support they needed. It pushed them closer to defeat, not all at once, but step by step, as their reach across the ocean began to shrink. The Python may have gone down quietly, far from the noise of battle, but her sinking echoed through the rest of the war. From that point onward, German submariners could no longer pretend they were invisible. They knew the ocean was watching. They knew the Allies could find them anywhere. They knew their secret lifelines were gone. That calm day in November 1941 became a turning point, not because of what was seen, but because of what was lost. It was the day the hunters of the Atlantic, the proud German submariners, realized that they were being hunted too. It was the day their silent empire beneath the waves began to crumble. It was the day their confidence broke. And above all, it was the day the Python disappeared, taking with her Germany's last hope of holding the distant seas. The horizon had looked empty. The sea had looked safe. But the ocean, it turned out, had been listening all along. That was the day the lifeline broke. That was the day the hunters became the hunted. That was the day the Python sank, and with her, the illusion of German control sank too.